We are on the record. The time now is 3:06. This marks the beginning of disc number 1 for the videotaped deposition testimony of Dr. Suzanne E. Martin in the matter of Monica Carmelo et al. Versus Melissa Longley et al. This case is pending in the Circuit Court for Montgomery County, Maryland. Case number 442210-V. Today's date is November the 27th, 2018. This deposition is being conducted at 204 Monroe Street, Rockville, Maryland. Will all attorneys present please identify themselves and who they represent?
Justin Zuber on behalf of the plaintiff.
Thomas Monahan on behalf of Susanna Martin, Leslie Mitchell, and MEP Health, LP.
Jeremy Crum on behalf of Adventist Healthcare.
Aaron Waldrop on behalf of Dr. Gisella Valderrama.
Mike Vonazowski on behalf of Dr. Edelstein.
Those on the phone?
Michael Rubin on behalf of Dr. Wisman, Ms. Longley, and International Pediatrics, PA.
My name is Michael Gay, and I'm with Legal Video Solutions. Our court reporter today is Emily Huffman with CRC Solomon, and will now swear in the witness.
Doctor, if you could raise your right hand, please. Do you declare and affirm, under the penalties of perjury, that your testimony this day will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, doctor. As I just stated, my name is Justin Zuber, and I'm going to be taking your deposition here today. Have you ever had your deposition taken before?
Yes.
Okay. On how many occasions?
Once.
You remember when that was?
A year or two ago.
Okay. Do you know if that was for a case that was pending in Montgomery County?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Were you a named defendant in that case?
Yes.
Can you briefly tell me the subject matter of that case?
A child with RSV.
Did the child die as a result of the RSV?
No.
And I think I read in your answers to interrogatories that you were perhaps dismissed in that case as a defendant?
I was.
Okay. In that case, did you see the child in the emergency room?
Yes, but they were never my patient.
Oh, can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
The patient was seen in an outlying facility and transferred to the Shady Grove ER in anticipation of being admitted to the pediatric floor. And my involvement was introducing myself to the patient and telling them the admitting physician was on their way down.
Okay, I see. All right. Have you ever given any sort of deposition testimony as a fact witness or a treating physician?
A deposition, I think, once as a fact witness and several times in court as a fact witness.
Okay. Do you remember what the subject matter of those cases generally were?
Almost exclusively involving child abuse.
I see. Okay. Have you ever been an expert in a medical malpractice case before?
No.
All right, moving along, I'm going to give you what's been marked as exhibit number 1, which is a copy of your CV. All right, so I just want to go over can you just briefly go over your employment history for me?
After finishing residency, I worked for a year in a pediatric emergency department in North Carolina, then left to start fellowship. After completing fellowship, came to Maryland to start working for MEP.
And it looks like in 2015, which is when the facts giving rise to this case occurred, you were an employee of MEP Health at that point, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And now you're working for U.S. Acute Care Solutions, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
The companies merged.
I see. And back in 2015, did you work solely at one hospital facility or multiple hospital facilities?
I intermittently worked at Frederick Memorial Hospital. They are now under the umbrella of USACS/MEP, but it was done as needing some help. They weren't fully staffed.
Okay. And back in 2015, did you hold any other positions or work for any other organizations besides MEP Health?
No.
Did you ever cover shifts at any other facilities other than perhaps Frederick Memorial and, I guess, Shady Grove?
No.
I see that you have a PhD in genetics. Is that right?
Yes.
Is there a, but you don't practice though as a geneticist, is that correct?
No.
Okay. Is there a reason why you practice as a pediatric emergency medicine doctor as opposed to something in genetics?
I like it better.
Okay. This is just my curiosity, just because, you know, PhD, MD are rare things, so.
There aren't very many of us in emergency medicine.
Okay. Have you reviewed any imaging studies in this case for Jonathan Valderrama?
No.
And I'm assuming because of that, you do not intend to render any opinions regarding any imaging studies in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
Looking at the second page of your CV, you do have some publications listed on here. They look like they deal exclusively with genetics. Do you have anything else that's not listed on here that you've written or given seminars about?
Not that I recall.
Are there any presentations that you've given that aren't listed on the second page of your CV?
Not that I can recall, though I've done informal talks to residents.
Okay, but that doesn't involve any written literature or anything like
No,
that, right?
not
Okay.
published.
All right. And it looks like you're board certified in pediatrics and pediatric emergency medicine, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I want you to tell me a little bit about Shady Grove Hospital back in 2015. It's my understanding that the Shady Grove facility that Jonathan Valadares was seen at, that they also have a radiology department. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that radiology department is in relative close proximity to the pediatric emergency department. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Is it on the same floor?
Yes.
And it's also my understanding that the pediatric emergency department is actually separate from the regular emergency department at Shady Grove. Is that correct?
It's down the hall.
Okay. And the radiology department, I'm assuming you're familiar with it. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've sent patients to that department before?
Yes.
Does that department have the ability to perform CT scans?
Yes.
Do they have the ability to perform CTAs?
Yes.
Do they have the ability to perform MRAs?
Yes.
Have you ordered CTAs and/or MRAs for patients before?
CTAs, yes. MRAs, I don't believe so.
Have you ordered CT scans, just regular CT scans before?
Yes.
Do you know generally how long it takes to perform a head CT scan?
A few minutes of the actual scan.
Are there any risks involved with a head CT scan for a pediatric patient?
Yes. Increased risk of malignancy.
So cancer?
Yes.
Do you know what percentage increased risk of malignancy there would be for a pediatric patient?
Not in any great detail. The literature is changing, and I have not seen anything in the past year or so to see what the most current research shows.
Okay. Did you know what the risk of malignancy from a CT scan for a pediatric patient was back in 2015?
That's a difficult question to answer because it's extrapolated data. I've seen numbers between an increase in 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 5,000 cases will result in a malignancy.
By the way, have you ever done any genetic research on genetics and vascular abnormalities in children?
No, that wasn't my area of expertise.
It looked like you were focused mainly on development of eyes, is that correct?
transcription factors.
Okay. Do you also work on gene therapy?
I have in the past, but not in many years.
All right. So we're going to kind of move along here. What did you review in preparation for your deposition here today?
Primarily my note from when the patient came in, and Dr. Mitchell's note, as well as some general information with regards to headaches in children.
Okay. Let's start with the general information about headaches in children. Where did you get that information from?
I don't even recall most of the medical information.
Okay. Is that something that you reviewed last night?
No, actually, I worked yesterday,
Okay. Do you know how long ago it was you reviewed that information?
within the past few weeks.
And were these like published articles?
Some were, others were summaries.
Okay, I'm assuming this is something that you searched for on the internet?
It wasn't exactly Google, but
Okay. Did you use something, there's PubMed, there's Elsevier, those type programs, did you use one of those in order to look up the articles?
I believe I looked at something through PubMed, but again, it was a while ago.
Okay. And I'm assuming you don't remember the name of the article?
There were several. I don't recall the exact articles that I looked at, and I didn't print them out.
Okay. Why did you go looking for those articles?
To get general information about this particular case.
I guess, can you be a little bit more specific? What kind of general information were you hoping to find?
Looking for how workup and diagnosis of various neurologic complaints in children.
Is there a reason why you felt the need to look up that information?
My own education.
Okay. Is it because you just felt like you needed to kind of bone up on it and learn more about it before coming and testifying?
More to see if what I had learned through years of practicing medicine, if there had been any particular changes recently.
Okay. Did you find any changes between, I guess, now and back in 2015 when you saw Jonathan?
No.
All right. Do you intend to rely upon or reference any of those articles when you testify at trial in this case?
Since I don't know all of the information that I looked at, complete with titles and authors, it would be difficult for me to point to one particular article.
Okay. I guess my questions are a little different. I don't want to be caught off guard at trial if all of a sudden you remember an article and you want to talk about it. So that's why I'm giving you the chance now to tell me about any article that you think might help you with your testimony.
I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Okay. In the event that you decide that you are going to reference an article, please let your attorney know. I need to know the name of that prior to going to trial so that I can have the opportunity to ask you some additional questions about that ahead of time. Is that fair?
Of course.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Gisella Valderrama. It's my understanding that she was a resident back in 2015 when she saw Jonathan. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what residency program she was a part of?
Pediatrics.
Do you know whether she came from a different hospital's residency program? In other words, like an outside hospital, not Shady Grove?
Shady Grove doesn't have a residency program.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at. Do you know what residency program she was actually a participant in?
Georgetown.
Okay. And was she someone who went to Georgetown University?
I don't know.
Do you know whether or not she received her medical degree in this country?
I don't know.
At the time that she was seeing Jonathan, I guess prior to that, how long had you been working with her?
The Georgetown residents have approximately 4 weeks to 1 month in their rotation. I don't know where in this rotation this particular visit fell.
Okay. Do you recall working with her for more than a week prior to this whole interaction she had with Jonathan?
I don't recall.
Do you remember, so for these residents that come into Shady Grove Hospital, what kind of training do they receive when they first start their 4-week rotation, for instance, in pediatrics?
Objection.
And general orientation to the way the emergency department works.
Okay. Are they given any specific training on how to properly evaluate and assess patients that come into the pediatric emergency department?
Objection.
That's something that's done as a general part of residency. It's not specific to the pediatric emergency department.
Okay, so there's no special training that they get really other than being oriented in the emergency department once they enter that phase of the rotation?
I object to the form of that question.
I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay, so when they start their 4-week or month-long rotation with the pediatric emergency department, do they receive any substantive training with respect to how to evaluate or assess pediatric emergency room patients?
Objection. Foundation. 1.
Their rotation in the pediatric emergency department is focused on how to evaluate patients in the emergency department as opposed to a clinic or a primary care office.
Okay. And is that done through hands-on contact with patients with a supervising physician?
Yes.
Do they have any sort of lectures or classes that supplement that clinical experience?
Objection.
Are you limiting to this while at Shady Grove?
Right, I'm talking specifically about the Shady Grove Pediatric Emergency Department.
We don't have formal lectures for the residents when they are rotating with us.
Okay. Do you know whether they receive something like that when they're at the hospital in general? Not, for instance, at the Pediatric Emergency Department, but do they receive some sort of lectures from the general hospital?
Do you mean at Georgetown?
No, I'm talking about Shady Grove.
They only rotate through the pediatric emergency department at
I
Shady
see.
Grove.
I see. Okay. So they may receive something additional from Georgetown, but you probably aren't specifically aware of what that is.
No.
Okay. How are the residents assigned a supervising physician at Shady Grove?
It is based on their shifts and the shift of the attending physician.
And do you know how the shifts are assigned?
They are assigned by the Shady Grove physician who is in charge of scheduling.
Do you by any chance know who that was back in 2015?
I believe it was Eric Shobitz, but I am not completely sure of that.
Okay. Is there any sort of policies and procedures at Shady Grove that you're aware of or have seen that specifically talk about the supervisory role of a physician such as yourself with respect to a resident? and the duties and obligations between the two.
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. Is there any sort of literature or written manual publications that you're aware of at Shady Grove that talk about the relationship between a supervisory physician and a resident?
I don't believe there is anything specific to Shady Grove.
Okay. Are you aware if there's anything like that that exists at Georgetown?
I wouldn't know.
Is there anything that you're aware of that provides you some sort of guidelines with respect to how often you're supposed to be there with the resident, when you're supposed to review the resident's work, when you're supposed to sign notes, anything like that that you're aware of at Shady Grove?
I'm not aware of anything.
Okay. Does MEP Health have anything like that back in 2015?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So, I guess what was the practice back in April of 2015 with respect to your role as a supervising physician when you have a resident who is seeing a patient? Can you give me a little bit of your understanding of what that role was back in 2015?
My role was and is to help residents learn how to function in a pediatric emergency department.
Okay. Were there any requirements that you had to be there physically in the room with the resident when they were assessing a patient?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Were there any requirements that you had to review the patient's, or I'm sorry, the resident's notes within a certain time frame after the resident wrote down their note?
Not that I'm aware of.
Were there any requirements with respect to how long you would have to wait before you had to sign off on something that the resident did?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Was there a requirement that you had to sign off on something the resident did?
Yes.
Okay. But beyond you having to sign off, there was no time requirements for when you had to do that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Were there any things back in April of 2015 that Gisella Valderrama could not do on her own with respect to Jonathan Valadares, whether it be examinations she wouldn't be able to do or orders she wouldn't be able to place, that she had to go through you in order to be able to do it?
We tend to discuss the plan of care with the residents either prior to or during the entering of orders, but the examination of the patient may not be concurrent.
Okay. Is there a requirement that when you have a resident who examines a patient and you're the supervising physician that you must also examine the patient at some point in time before that patient's either admitted or discharged?
All patients who come through the pediatric emergency department, if they are seen by a resident, are also seen by the attending physician.
Okay. But that doesn't have to happen concurrent, is that correct?
Not at the exact same time.
Okay.
The resident may examine the patient first, I'm in there 5 minutes later, we may examine the patient at the same time, but there is not a time limit.
Okay. And I think I heard you correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is Gisella Valderrama could not simply write an order and have the order go through without you signing off on the order. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay. I guess explain to me how it works.
So there are some orders that are appropriate to start as ordered by a resident, like giving an antipyretic, an antiemetic, without immediate confirmation by the attending. but for most attendings, we prefer anything more complicated than that to be discussed with us first.
Okay. So if I'm a resident and I am starting this 4-week phase of my program, how would I know what I can do and what I can't do?
I'm not sure how to answer that question since I haven't been a Georgetown resident.
Okay. So Georgetown's the one that, in what you recall or your understanding is that they delineate what the residents are able to write orders for and what they can't write orders for?
Objection.
No, I can go based on my experience when I was a resident. And I don't know if Georgetown has different rules or a different culture than where I trained.
Trying to speed this up, but back in April of 2015, who determined that, for instance, a resident could write an order for an emetic or something like that versus something more complicated where it had to go through a supervising physician?
I don't think there's a specific rule written down for that.
Okay. So if you're a resident, how do you know that you're able to write something that's not so complicated that it has to be run by a supervising physician?
Again, it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay. I'm going to get really general here, and I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Back in April of 2015, are you aware of any policies or procedures that applied to residents in the pediatric emergency department at Shady Grove?
I am sure there is paperwork under the agreement from Georgetown and our facility, but I have not seen it.
Okay. The residents aren't assigned to one supervising physician the entire time they're in the pediatric emergency department, is that correct?
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay. So Gisella Valderrama could have had multiple supervising physicians depending upon the scheduling, is that right?
Yes.
Do you know Leslie Mitchell?
Yes.
How long have you known her?
6 years?
Are you friends with her?
We're colleagues.
Do you attend any sort of functions outside of work?
Occasional social events associated with MEP or USACS.
Have you spoken with her at all about the facts of this case?
The facts of the case, no.
Have you spoken with her at all about the case?
Only in the fact that it was ongoing.
Okay. Nothing more specific than that?
No.
Do you remember when you spoke to her about that?
Right when we found out about the case being filed.
Have you spoken with Dr. Valderrama about this case?
I haven't.
When was the last time you had any contact with Dr. Valderrama?
That would have been whenever she had her last rotation at Shady Grove.
Do you know when that was?
I don't.
I'm assuming that would have been back in 2015, right, since they were 4-week rotations?
There are 2 4-week rotations that they do, but
Okay.
it would have been no later than July of 2015.
I see. The 2 4-week rotations, can you elaborate on that? How does that work?
The general pediatric residents tend to have 2 4-week rotations in the pediatric ER during their 3rd year at Shady Grove. They
Okay.
can be concurrent or they can be separated.
And you don't know whether she was in her 1st or her 2nd at the time she saw Jonathan?
I don't recall.
Besides what you have read in preparation for this deposition, do you have an independent recollection of Jonathan or his mother?
I do.
Okay. What do you remember?
I remember what room he was in. I remember his appearance when I first saw him.
Okay.
I remember where his mother was sitting.
Okay.
And I remember talking to him right before he was discharged.
Okay, well, let's go down the list. What room was he in?
Room 9.
And where is room 9, I guess, located on the pediatric emergency room floor?
That would best be described with a picture.
Okay. Can you tell me what it's near? Is it near like a nurse's station or?
It's at the start of a hallway next to one of the bathrooms.
Start of the main hallway?
The emergency department is vaguely T-shaped.
Okay. What do you remember about his appearance?
At which time?
Okay, so how many times did you see Jonathan?
At least 3.
So let's start with the first time that you saw Jonathan. Do you remember what day it was?
It was a Thursday evening.
In April?
Yes.
Do you remember what date?
Per the records, it was the 2nd.
Okay. And what time did you see him on April the 2nd for the first time?
I don't remember the exact time.
Okay.
After 5 p.m.
So tell me what he looked like the first time you saw him.
Sitting in a stretcher, calm, in no apparent distress.
Did you talk to him on that occasion?
Yes.
And what did he say to you?
That is when I did my initial history and physical. But I don't have exact recollections of what he said.
Okay.
These are general impressions going back quite some time.
Okay. And we'll look at your note. But off the top of your head, it sounds like you remember him sitting there and looking in no apparent distress and
Yes.
calm. Okay. Anything else that you remember before we look at your notes later on?
No.
Where was his mom at that point when you saw him for the first time?
Sitting in a chair to my right.
When you came in and did your history and physical, did you talk with the mom or did you talk with Jonathan?
Both.
Did you have any difficulty communicating with either one of them?
Not that I recall.
Was anybody in the room with you when you saw him for the first time? Besides, obviously, Jonathan and his mother.
I don't recall.
Do you know when you saw him the first time if that was after he had already been seen by Dr. Valderrama?
I believe so.
When you saw him the first time, is that after he had already been receiving medication?
No.
How are you so sure of that?
Because I'm the one that ordered the medications.
So Dr. Valderrama did not order any medications? That's your recollection?
I don't believe so. I would need to review the chart.
Okay. We're going to get into the chart. I'm really just asking your
That's
your
fine.
off the top of your head recollection. Beyond that, any other specifics that come to mind?
No.
Okay. The second encounter, do you remember how long after the first encounter you made contact with them again?
I don't. And when I say at least 3, I make it a practice as I walk by a room for a patient who's receiving treatment or is still in the ER to knock on the door and see how everybody is doing.
Okay. Do you remember anything off the top of your head about the second interaction?
No.
Okay. Do you know, I know it's your custom and practice, but do you actually have a specific recollection of seeing him 3 times?
I know it was the beginning, the end, and at least once in between to knock on the door and see how he was doing.
Is it your custom and practice to put a note in the medical chart if you do that?
If I'm seeing the patient on my own, yes, because I put it in under a reevaluation. When it is a resident chart, usually not.
By the way, are there any policies and procedures regarding how you're supposed to document your notes in a resident chart?
I don't believe there's anything written down.
Is there any custom and practice that you're aware of that was in effect back in April 2015 with regards to how it's typically done?
My custom and practice or the hospital's?
Well, what's your custom and practice?
When I have a resident chart, my information is contained in a paragraph at the bottom under the teaching attestation.
Okay. Do you have a custom and practice as far as how long you wait before you write your note?
I try and write it as soon as possible.
You had mentioned the hospital. Does the hospital have any sort of policy about documenting in a residence chart?
Not that I'm aware of.
Does the hospital have a policy with respect to how long you could wait before you could make your note in the residence chart?
Not that I'm aware of.
Could Dr. Valderrama order head imaging studies for Jonathan if she wanted to?
Does she have the computer access to do so?
Does she have the authority to do so?
That is also case-by-case dependent.
So in the case of Jonathan, did she have the authority to order head imaging if she felt that it was required?
If yes, but when there is imaging that is potentially ordered, usually the residents will discuss that with the attending first.
Okay, and I understand usually they might do that, but there was nothing preventing, or there's no rule or policy that she couldn't order head imaging for him if she felt that it was needed. Is that right?
Again, I don't think there is anything written down. However, for imaging, especially something like a head CT, that's usually done in conjunction with discussion and approval by the attending.
Okay. You didn't have any conversations with Dr. Valderrama where you actually pulled her aside and told her that if you're going to order something like head imaging for a child that you need to run it by me before you do it. Is that correct?
I don't recall.
Is that some part of your custom and practice where you kind of lay out those boundaries ahead of time with the resident?
Sometimes, but not always.
Do you have any recollection of doing that with Dr. Valderrama?
No recollection at all.
The third time that you saw Jonathan, that would have been, I guess, the last time before he was discharged?
Yes.
Okay. And I think I probably know the answer to this, but Jonathan couldn't be discharged unless you had signed off on the discharge. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay, so Dr. Valderrama couldn't have discharged him on her own. Is that correct?
no.
Okay.
No meaning.
No, she could not discharge him without the attending approval.
Okay. So you said you looked at your note, but I'm assuming you looked at the entire medical chart for April the 2nd, 2015. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And you also said that you looked at some documentation from Dr. Mitchell.
in preparation for the deposition, yes.
Okay. Obviously, you wouldn't have known that at the time because that happened on April the 5th and you saw Jonathan on April the 2nd, right?
Correct.
Okay. Is there some reason why you looked at the notes for Dr. Mitchell in preparation for this deposition?
I was curious about the visit.
Okay. Was there anything about Dr. Mitchell's notes that you found important or interesting?
I'm not going to let her get into anything that happened after she saw this patient. She's here to talk about her care.
Okay. Well, I mean, she said she looked at it. So,
That may be.
did you look at any of the information from International Pediatrics?
About a week ago in conjunction with my attorney.
Okay. And I don't want to know anything about what your attorney told you, but did you find any of the information from International Pediatrics important to your understanding of what was going on with Jonathan?
Objection form.
Since I had no access to any of their records prior to the visit, I wouldn't be able to comment on that.
Okay. So you're looking at them just as to get general information about the entire picture of what was going on with Jonathan, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. When did you first learn that Jonathan had an aneurysm that ruptured?
A few weeks after my visit with him,
And how did you find out about that?
one of my colleagues called me.
And what colleague was that?
Scott Friedman.
And who is Scott Friedman?
He is the head of the pediatric ER.
Do you know, what did Scott Friedman tell you?
He told me that the patient had come in very ill and that he expired.
Scott Friedman is the head of the pediatric department at Shady Grove?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know where he got that information from?
I don't.
And you had said that he came in very ill. Was it your understanding that he came in very ill to Shady Grove?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I haven't seen any other notes from any other visits.
Okay. Did he say anything about specifically when Jonathan came in very ill?
I don't recall.
Did he say anything about when Jonathan expired?
I don't recall.
Do you know why he was calling to tell you that?
Because I'd seen him and he wanted to let me know what had happened.
Is that just a custom and practice at Shady Grove that you get this information if it's available and you had seen the patient in the past?
Sometimes.
Did Scott Friedman have any questions for you about your contact with Jonathan?
No, it was more information given.
He give you any other information?
Not that I recall.
All right. Did you talk with anybody else about Jonathan at any point in time after you had seen him?
After his death, I mentioned it to my husband.
Okay. Any particular reason you did that?
I'm not sure how to answer that question.
How is that relevant? The conversation itself is privileged.
All right, I'll move on. All right, let's take a look at your note. Actually, I think we have, so I'm going to use the numbers that are on the very bottom of the chart, and I think they should correspond since this is the chart that was actually provided by your attorney. So you see where the numbers are at the very bottom?
Mm-hmm.
If you go to 2460, it might be further upstream. All right, so this is
How is that
what?
titled, that page?
The pre-arrival summary.
Got it. Thank you.
So this says pre-arrival summary. It looks like it was, the information was taken by Jessa Miller, who looks like she's a nurse, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is this something that you had seen prior to seeing Jonathan?
I don't recall.
Is this something that you would have had access to prior to seeing Jonathan?
Yes.
And how would you have had access to it?
It would be in our computer system.
And if I'm looking at your computer system, is it separate categories and you just click on them and you can see if there's some sort of pre-arrival information?
It would be listed under the notes section.
Okay. So looking at this note, and you read along with me, says patient being sent by Christine at International Pediatrics with complaint severe headache, head and neck pain with dizziness and nausea, vomiting, vomited 10 times since last night, no fever or known injury, history of same in January. Would that have been concerning to you knowing that this was the pediatrician who had sent Jonathan to the emergency room that day?
I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Okay.
Concerning in what way?
So there's patients that come to the emergency room in all different types of fashions. The fact that this was a patient who's being sent by the pediatrician who seems to be concerned about the symptoms, is that something that would make you more concerned that the patient might be suffering something serious?
More than what?
More than a typical patient who comes in, you know, on their own volition.
Not necessarily.
Okay. And why would that be?
Because an ill patient can walk in off the street and a patient who is less ill can be sent by their pediatrician.
Would you agree with me that a child's pediatrician usually knows the child's medical history better than a doctor in the emergency department?
Not necessarily.
Okay. In the case of Jonathan, do you have any reason to believe that his pediatrician didn't know his medical history well?
I have no reason to think
Section
that.
Foundation.
him being sent to the hospital with the complaint of severe head and neck pain with dizziness and nausea, vomiting, are those symptoms concerning to you at all, that he might have something going on with his head?
By definition, a headache is going to involve something with his head.
Okay. So based upon these symptoms, what would be in your differential diagnosis form?
From the chief complaint,
Mm-hmm.
it would be quite long and involved.
Okay. So you would have to do your examination and history before you could come up with your differential diagnosis, is that correct?
No, a differential diagnosis from a chief complaint is going to be much broader than a differential diagnosis after a history and after a physical.
Okay. This pre-arrival summary information, is this important to you in any fashion as a healthcare provider?
Yes,
Why is it important?
because it gives us an idea of what the patient was complaining about at the pediatrician's office, and in theory, their concern to have a further evaluation done.
Okay. Does that change in any fashion the scope of your evaluation for the patient?
If a patient comes in from the pediatrician versus coming in from of their own volition,
Sure.
not necessarily.
Has it ever changed the scope of your evaluation when you had a patient like that?
I object to the form and foundation. You may answer.
That's a hard question to answer.
Could it change the scope of your evaluation?
Same objection.
I don't have an answer to that question.
Did it change the scope of your evaluation with respect to Jonathan Valderrama?
The information provided from the primary care physician or practitioner can be helpful, but it doesn't always drive our treatment in the emergency department.
But did it drive anything with respect to Jonathan?
I take every patient on a case-by-case basis.
Was this information from the pediatrician important to your assessment of Jonathan Valderrama when you saw him on April the 2nd, 2015?
It helps give me information with regards to how he was presenting to his pediatrician's office,
Okay. And how was it helpful to you?
because it tells me that he was complaining of head pain, neck pain, vomiting, and a history of the same in January.
Okay. And the fact that it tells you that, how does that help you then with your next steps in assessing the patient?
It gives me a jumping off point to discuss history with the patient and his family.
Okay. So knowing this information, how did that change in any way how you approached the situation with the patient when you went in to assess him?
It didn't.
Okay. So this was a jumping off point, you had said. So how did that help you in your conversation with the patient when you assessed him?
The information that we are given on a pre-arrival note can help us to start asking the reason that the patient came to the emergency department, but it doesn't necessarily require us or change what we do based on our own history and physical.
I understand. I think what I'm trying to understand from you is, does it make any difference when you have a patient like this and you're receiving the information from a pediatrician who knows the patient, had just seen the patient, is sending them to the emergency room for further evaluation versus someone who just walked in off the street?
I object. I think it's been asked and answered. You may go ahead.
If I have a patient who is sent from their primary care physician for concern of appendicitis, their history and physical while they're in the emergency department may or may not be consistent with what we see ourselves and may or may not result in an evaluation for appendicitis.
Okay. All right. Did you reach out and speak with anybody at International Pediatrics to follow up on the reason that he was sent to the emergency department on April the 2nd?
I sent an automatic fax to their office after he was seen and discharged.
Okay. You have the entire medical chart there. Can you just identify for me what was actually sent over to them?
Of note, if the primary care office asks for a callback, we do. If they don't ask for a callback, we don't necessarily call back.
Do you have any way of knowing whether they had asked for a callback?
It's usually indicated in the pre-arrival note.
Okay, and I think you would agree with me that it doesn't appear as though that's indicated in the note. Is that correct?
Correct. I cannot find the form.
Is it possible that a form was never sent?
If it didn't go through the computer system, possibly, but it's part of our discharge orders.
And I think I may have seen forms like that in the past. They actually do say fax pretty much on top. Is that correct?
I'm trying to remember for Shady Grove, and I don't know if it says fax on the top, but it's a form I recognize when I see it.
Okay. And you don't see it in this medical chart, is that correct?
I don't.
All right. Tom, if you could double check and see if there's something that I don't have, just let me know.
Okay.
Do you see any documentation in this chart indicating that any additional or any information was sent over to International Pediatrics?
Not that I've seen.
You're referring to April 2, right?
Correct. Right. I want to know about your visit with Jonathan. Okay. If it's not in the chart, Am I correct in saying that it looks like nothing like that was sent over to International Pediatrics?
I don't know. It's part of our usual custom and practice.
Okay. And if nothing was sent over, you don't recall making any phone calls over to anybody at International Pediatrics after Jonathan was seen, is that correct?
If a phone call wasn't requested, I wouldn't have called.
Do you know whether anybody else had called International Pediatrics, whether it would have been Gisella Valderrama or one of the nurses?
The nurses usually don't initiate a call like that. I don't know whether or not Dr. Valderrama did make a call.
Okay. Is it custom and practice that if a call like that was made, that there would be a note in the medical chart?
It should be.
Okay, so let's go to, I'm trying to, if you go to page 6 of 60, this is just a general question. I just want to make sure I know everybody who's on these pages. So let me know when you're there. Upper right-hand corner, it says attending Brett Gamma. Who is that?
He is one of the adult ER physicians who is the equivalent to Scott Friedman for MEP in general.
Do you know why his name's listed on this chart?
The computer frequently automatic assigns a physician under that tab.
Okay. As far as you know, he did not have any contact with Jonathan?
No.
The day Jonathan came in on April the 2nd, what other doctors were working there that day besides you? And Dr. Valderrama, obviously.
In the pediatric department?
Correct.
There may have been another resident who was on at that time, but I don't recall.
Are you referring to the pediatric emergency department?
Yes.
So let's go to your note. Which I think is on page 13 of 60. So, do you know whether you were there? I think you said this before. You don't recall whether you were there at the same time Dr. Valderrama did her evaluation.
I don't recall.
Okay. Do you know if this note was written right after you did your evaluation of Jonathan?
The supervisory addendum?
Uh-huh.
It wasn't.
Okay. And when was this note written?
It was written immediately prior to me signing the note.
Okay. Which was on April the 7th. It looks like at 11:07.
Yes.
Is there a reason why it was written several days later?
The note format with residents is they complete their notes, and then when they are finished with their notes, they sign it, and it's forwarded to us in a electronic mailbox. Then we open the note and sign the note.
Okay. And it looks like Dr. Valderrama, she signed her note on April the 3rd, 2015. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Any reason why it took you approximately 4 days to sign it?
I signed it when I came back from my next shift.
Okay. Do you have the ability to review these notes remotely?
No,
You don't have any access to the medical charts remotely?
only at the hospital. My computer doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
But as a physician, though, let's assume that your computer was fully functional. You would have the ability to look at charts remotely from home, correct?
I have never been able to get it to function at my house.
Okay.
So the only way I have to write my notes is when I'm physically at the hospital.
Have you ever asked for any help in getting your computer to work so you can look at them at home?
Yes, I have.
All right, and I'm assuming that didn't make any difference. Is that
No,
right?
it didn't.
Okay. But there is, for physicians, there is some sort of portal or something like that that is provided so that, in theory, you could have access to review them remotely. Is that right?
It works for some people, but it has not in 6 years been able to work for me.
Okay. All right. So looking at your note here, you have notes, I have reviewed the ED history and physical done by the resident physician and agree with the findings and plan. I'm assuming that that refers to the note that is on page 10 of 6C.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you say that you reviewed that, does that mean that you reviewed that at the time that you wrote your note, or that you reviewed it back when you saw Jonathan on April the 2nd?
I reviewed it at the time I wrote my note.
Okay. Is there a reason why you didn't review it back when you saw Jonathan on April the 2nd?
Because I didn't have the note in my computer box.
Okay. Do you have the ability to review residents' notes and nurses' notes at the time that you see patients such as Jonathan?
I can't review them until they're written.
So at the time you saw Jonathan, there was no nurses' notes and no notes by Dr. Valderrama.
There were nurses' notes. There was not yet a note by the resident.
Do you remember what nurses' notes there were at the time that you saw Jonathan?
Only by reviewing the chart.
Okay. Looking at the chart, can you tell me which notes you would have been able to see?
The pre-arrival note. The triage note. Vital signs. Any nursing notes that were commentaries.
When you write your note, how are you able to recall the information from several days earlier?
Because I remember the patient.
Do you speak into kind of a recording device at all or dictate in any fashion?
We do now. At the time, it was typed.
Okay. I guess what was typed?
Physically using fingers at a keyboard.
Okay. So your note is based upon other information that was typed down somewhere?
No, I typed the note
Okay.
directly.
That's what I wanted. That's what I'm getting at. So this is purely based upon your recollection several days earlier of having seen the patient.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to go over this then a little bit further. It says you've done your own history and physical and have these additional findings Patient with headache since December. By the way, where did you get that information from?
From the patient and his mother.
And that's something that you recalled several days later?
Yes.
And they specifically said that he's been having headaches since December?
No, it's something I asked.
Okay. So you asked, what was the exact question that you recall asking them?
I don't recall the exact question, but the patient told me that he'd been having headaches, and I said, for how long? And he said December.
Did he say December in English?
Yes.
Did you ask him any additional questions about how frequently he was having headaches since December?
Yes.
And what was his response?
I don't know. That was his response, not mine.
Okay. Did you ask his mom how frequently he was having headaches since December?
Yes.
And what did she say?
She didn't know either.
The next thing you wrote is currently worse than his baseline, but not as bad as has been at its worst. So where did you get that information?
Anytime a patient comes in with headaches, that's one of the questions I always ask. Is this the worst headache you've ever had? How bad is it compared to headaches you've had in the past?
Okay. Did you ask that as separate questions to Jonathan?
Likely.
Okay. Do you remember?
No.
What were his responses? Do you remember specifically? I'm assuming he didn't use these specific
Word
words.
for word, I do not remember.
Okay.
He told me this was not the worst headache he'd ever had.
Okay.
That he'd had others that were worse.
But you would agree with me, the way this is typed is not word for word what either Jonathan or his mother actually said to you.
No.
Do you recall what they said about his headaches being worse than baseline?
That the headache he was having at that time was worse than he'd had for his chronic headache, but that it was not the worst that it had been.
Did Jonathan or his mom tell you that he had chronic headaches?
Jonathan did, yes.
He used the word chronic.
He didn't use the word chronic. He said he'd been having headaches off and on since December.
Okay. So when I asked you before how often he was having headaches, he actually said that he was having headaches off and on since December?
He said, I've been having headaches since December. Or when I said, how long have you been having headaches? December.
Okay. To me, that sounds like two different things. You said... So
I object. You can ask questions, but please don't testify.
you had said that you asked how often you were having headaches to Jonathan, correct?
Yes.
And did he just say December?
No.
Okay. What do you recall him actually saying?
That how often he was having headaches?
Right.
He didn't know.
Okay.
He said, I don't know.
What question did you ask where you remember him saying that he's been having headaches on and off since December?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. You said at some point he told you he's been having headaches on and off since December, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember what question you asked that elicited that response?
He did not say word for word, I have been having headaches off and on since December. He said, I've been having headache, or I apologize. I don't know his exact word for word response to that. I'm going based on what he told me and my summation of.
Okay. So what you wrote here is your interpretation of what you remember him saying?
In a very brief fashion.
That would be a yes, right?
I suppose.
Do you remember the question? So the other part of what you wrote here is not as bad as has been at its worst. And you told me that those aren't his words. What did he say that prompted you to write that?
I don't recall his exact words.
Okay. Do you remember the question you asked him that may have elicited the information that led you to put that into the chart?
My custom and practice for any patient with a headache is to ask, is this headache right now the worst it's ever been?
Okay. What other questions did you ask about his headaches? I mean, in terms of when they first started.
I can go by what I ask every patient who comes in with a headache, the questions that I ask.
Okay. I'd like to know, what questions do you typically ask of a patient that comes in with headaches?
I ask about the particular headache that they are having at that moment, how long it's been going on, what it feels like, where it is, associated symptoms, what medicines have you tried, have they had headaches like this similar in the past? If they have, how often, how many, when the headache started, any response to treatment, anything that makes the headache worse, anything that makes the headache better.
Okay. And did you ask all those questions of Jonathan and his mother?
I would have, yes.
Do you remember whether you did that?
It is my custom and practice to ask that of every patient who comes in with a headache.
Okay. But do you specifically remember doing that?
I specifically remember asking him when his headaches had started
Okay.
and asking about how often they happened and him saying, I don't know.
Okay. Was anybody else present in the room when you had that conversation with him?
I don't recall.
Was Jonathan having any trouble understanding you?
He didn't seem to.
Did Jonathan speak Spanish at any point in time when you were conversing with him?
Not that I recall.
You mentioned that he was having chronic headaches. How did you reach that conclusion?
Because of what he told me.
What was it about what he told you that led you to believe that they're chronic headaches?
Because he had been having headaches for 4 months, off and on.
Okay. I thought you had told me that he didn't know how often he was having the headaches.
He didn't.
Okay.
And that was one of my questions. However, he said off and on, but as to how frequently the off and the on were, he didn't know. Because those are two different questions.
I guess, so from that information, you determined that he had chronic headaches, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar of any guidelines or protocols or literature out there that actually defines the term chronic headaches?
Not to the level that a neurologist would have. There are some that say greater than 15 days in a month, but I'm not as familiar with them as a neurologist would be.
Correct. I think the greater than 15 days in a month is the International Headache Society classification system. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Have you ever read that classification scheme?
Likely during my training at some point.
But you don't, do you use that in your practice?
It's not something that we use in the emergency department.
You know what the difference is between a primary headache and a secondary headache?
Yes.
What's the difference?
Primary headache tends to be specifically pain receptors in the brain. Secondary headache can be from a cause either outside the brain or from something else like a mass.
Do you diagnose patients in the emergency room with migraines?
No,
And why is that?
because that's not part of the emergency medicine practice.
If you go further up the page, on page 13 of 60, do you see where it says impression and plan?
Yes,
It's got diagnosis, plan, condition, and under condition it has patient was given the following educational materials,
yes,
and it says headache, migraine, classical.
yes.
Who wrote that information there?
That was the discharge information that was provided by the resident.
All right, so that would have been Dr. Valderrama that elected to give that information to the patient?
Yes.
Why would the patient be told that, or be given educational materials on migraine headaches if they can't be diagnosed with the migraine headaches in the emergency room?
I object to the foundation.
That would be something you would have to ask Dr. Valderrama why she selected that. My practice tends to be to select the patient information that says headache unspecified.
Does the term classical migraine mean anything to you?
Yes, as a diagnosis.
Okay, how is a classical migraine different from a common migraine?
That's something that you would have to ask a neurologist because it's not part of my specialty.
Do you know why classical migraine was, the information was given to the patient regarding classical migraines?
Didn't you just ask that?
It was about migraines in general. I'm asking about classical
The-
migraines now.
Patient education forms are a group of general information about potential medical problems that are provided as an educational source. They are not a diagnosis.
Did you at any point tell Jonathan and his mother that your diagnosis included migraines?
No.
Oh, okay. Was it your understanding that Jonathan did not have an aura associated with his headaches?
From his history, I don't believe so.
Do you know whether an aura is something that is required in order for a headache to be classified as a classical migraine?
Again, I don't diagnose migraines.
Based upon your history, physical, and examination of Jonathan, what was in your differential diagnosis for Jonathan's condition?
That's a difficult question to answer because differential diagnosis is not an absolute of everything that the symptoms could represent. We go more on a working diagnosis.
To you, what's the difference between a working diagnosis and a differential diagnosis?
A working diagnosis is one thing, a differential diagnosis is more extensive.
Did you reach a differential diagnosis for Jonathan when you saw him on April the 2nd, 2015?
Again, that's a difficult question to answer because his differential diagnosis was extensive.
Can you tell me what was in his differential diagnosis? I understand it was extensive, but
There are dozens, if not more than that, symptoms that could cause headaches.
Yes or no, did you reach a differential diagnosis for Jonathan when you saw him on April the 2nd, 2015?
Again, we've been moving away from using the term differential diagnosis as opposed to a working diagnosis.
Does that mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it was really a yes or no question. Does that mean that you did not have a differential diagnosis for Jonathan when you saw him on April the 2nd?
It's a question that is difficult to answer because a differential is something of possible diagnoses that may or may not be likely given a patient's presentation. For example, a Chiari malformation could be on his differential diagnosis. But again, we're moving away from using a list of potential diagnoses and moving more towards a working diagnosis.
Did you use differential diagnosis back in 2015?
No.
So you don't use differential diagnosis at all in your practice?
That's not the right way to say it. A differential diagnosis is something that is considered for a patient, but I don't have an exhaustive list of everything that would have been on the list. Instead, it would be diagnoses that are more or less likely, given history, physical.
Well, what was more or less likely for Jonathan based upon your visit with him on April the 2nd, 2015?
At this point, he had a diagnosis of headache, unspecified, possibly chronic, with an acute exacerbation.
Is that the only thing that was more or less likely?
That alone encompasses a large number of potential underdiagnoses.
Okay. Did you have a list of potential causes for his headache based upon your examination of him on April the 2nd, 2015?
Did I have a list in my mind of the dozens of potential causes for his headache and a need for an investigation to actually, that's not even the right way to say that. I had potential theories of possible diagnoses for him, but again, that's not something that's necessarily reached in the emergency department. I had a working diagnosis and a plan.
What was your working diagnosis and your plan?
That's what I had mentioned before. Headache, chronic symptoms with an acute exacerbation.
Okay, we gotta run out of tape. Let's take a break.
Okay.
Time now is 4:35. We are going off the record. This is the end of disc number 1. The time now is 4:43. We are back on the record. This is the beginning of disc number 2.
All right, doctor. We were talking a little bit before about your working diagnosis. Can you tell me, did you have in your mind at all a list of possible causes for Jonathan's headaches after you assessed him and evaluated him on April the 2nd?
Things that were likely?
Correct.
Yes.
And what was in that list?
Primary headache was on the list. Migraine was on the list. PR malformation was on the list. And I'm sure there are others, but again,
I want to know.
Did you finish?
for the moment.
Okay, I thought you, again, was to be followed by something, that's fine.
Okay. I want you to tell me all the ones that you considered. So I'm trying to give you whatever time you need in order to tell me all of them.
You're going to have to clarify. The last question was after the history and physical, what were the likely diagnoses she was entertaining? And now you're asking all possible, and are you asking again after the history and physical?
She had said that there were some others, and then she stopped. I just want to make sure that I understand all of the things that you considered as causes, likely causes.
After the history and physical?
Right.
Okay.
There's a difference between likely causes and possible causes.
Okay. What's the difference to you?
So, for example, a neoplasm in his brain could be a potential cause for somebody with a headache and neck pain and vomiting. Based on his history and his physical, it was less likely. However, it is still on the differential.
Anything else besides that?
I
Object. Again, are you asking her for likely, a list of likely causes after the history and physical?
So you
She just
listed.
described something that she said would not be likely after the history and physical, and your question was anything else other than that, which seems to suggest
Okay.
you're confusing
Let
not
me-
likely and likely.
Let me rephrase the question. You had given me 3 likely causes, okay? Is that correct?
no, there are 3 possible causes.
All right. I thought I had asked you what was the likely causes that you had in your mind after you did your history and physical.
And again, I know this is frustrating, but it's not something that I can give you an exhaustive list and then have them ranked in likely versus unlikely order.
All right. So did you rank them in your mind, likely versus unlikely, after you did your history and physical of Jonathan?
There were things that were significantly less likely versus more likely based on his history and physical, but I couldn't rank them in order.
Okay, and I'm not asking you to rank them in order. What I'd like to know is what were I want to know all of the more likely things. You gave me 3 before. I just want to make sure those are all of them.
It couldn't be all of them, because there are so many different things that can cause headache that we may or may not be able to find immediately on a first visit to the ER. And that's because so many visits to the ER have a disposition where we don't have the exact cause upon discharge.
I understand, but you came up with a list in your mind of possible things that could be responsible for Jonathan's presentation when you saw him on April the 2nd, 2015, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in that list, it sounds like some were more likely in your mind than others, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All I want to know is the ones that you thought were more likely.
I gave you, I believe, 3 of them that were more likely than some that would have been less likely. But I don't have a recollection of every single thing that I thought would be likely as a diagnosis for him.
Okay. Did you consider the possibility that he may have a brain bleed?
Absolutely.
Okay. Was that more or less likely?
Less likely.
And why was that less likely?
He didn't have a lot of the signs and symptoms that are often associated with a bleed in the head.
And what are the signs and symptoms that are often associated with a bleed in the head?
Sudden onset of the worst headache of your life, acute onset of the symptoms, focal neurologic changes, altered mental status, seizure, symptoms concerning for increased intracranial pressure are some of the potential symptoms.
Do you know whether you need to have all of those things in order for a brain bleed to be more likely?
No.
Do you know how many of those things you need in order for a brain bleed to be more likely?
Object the form.
There's not a numerical designation for that.
Does a pediatric patient need to have focal neurological deficits in order for a brain bleed to be more likely?
Objection to form.
More likely? Yes.
Okay. What's your definition of focal neurological deficits?
Cranial nerve abnormalities are common, seizure-like activity, mental status changes, pupillary changes, difficulty speaking.
I'm assuming in your position as an emergency room physician who sees pediatric patients, you've seen quite a few kids with the presentation of headaches, correct?
Yes.
And those headaches, how often do you see pediatric patients with complaints of headache pain that is specifically in the occipital area of the head?
Inclusive of the occipital area of the head?
What about solely in the occipital area of the head?
10%?
Would you consider that to be a rare location for a pediatric patient to have a headache?
It's less common. I don't know if I would use the word rare
Do you read Up to Date?
on occasion.
Do you know whether Up to Date, have you ever read any Up to Date articles regarding pediatric patients with headaches?
Yes.
Do you know whether that lists headaches in the occipital area of the head for pediatric patients as a worrisome finding?
I know that it can be considered to be a worrisome finding, but is not pathognomonic.
How are you using the term pathognomonic?
Every occipital headache is something potentially lethal
Okay.
or associated with one specific diagnosis.
Turn to page 51 of Jonathan's record. Yep. You see the nurse's note there? It says pain site number 1.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Pain site number 1.
Yes.
Okay. Where does it say the location of Jonathan's head pain was?
Occipital.
And this is a note that you would have been able to see, I think, at the time that you saw Jonathan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was that significant to you when you saw Jonathan?
It is a part of his history.
Is there a reason why there's no mention of that in your teaching supervisory addendum note?
Because it was mentioned in the resident's note.
Okay. How did that impact the medical decision-making for Jonathan?
It's a more unusual location for a headache, and that made us question the patient a little bit more extensively about the location of his headache.
What more extensive investigation did you do based upon the location of the headache pain in the occipital area?
It makes us consider things other than, say, sinusitis or a retroorbital headache, tension headache, and is part of the picture of his history.
So, based upon the fact that he had occipital headache pain, why is it that head imaging wasn't considered for him?
He didn't have any other criteria at the time that was concerning for need for imaging at that time.
I think you just told me, though, that headache pain in the occipital area could potentially indicate something that could be lethal for the child, correct?
I object to
No.
the form. She said just you asked her what she meant by pathic pneumonic after telling you that it's not pathic pneumonic. And her description of pathic pneumonic was lethal or diagnostic. So she did not say what you just represented.
Okay. Did you understand my question?
You wanted to know whether or not the fact that he had an occipital headache meant that he needed head imaging at that time.
Mm-hmm.
That is one part of the history and physical that might drive someone to ask for imaging. But the location alone would not be a reason to order imaging in the absence of other concerning parts of the history and physical.
Were there any other parts of his history and physical that you thought were concerning that were leaning towards ordering head imaging?
At the time of his visit to me, no.
Okay. The way you phrase it, is there some other point in time that you thought that he needed head imaging?
When he had altered mental status.
Okay. So you're talking about later on down the road. Okay.
Yes.
So in order for you to have reached a point where you would have ordered head imaging for him, he would have needed to have some sort of focal neurological deficit. It sounds like that's what you're saying.
Object to the form.
No.
Okay. So you would have potentially ordered head imaging without focal neurological deficit. Is that correct?
There are some cases that would be concerning for a need for emergent head imaging in the absence of focal neurologic findings.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of that?
A chronic progressive headache, symptoms that are concerning for increased intracranial pressure, like unable to lie flat. If symptoms do not improve or continue to worsen.
So how are you defining the first thing that you told me about the chronic continuous headache?
Chronic progressive headaches can be concerning for intracranial mass they tend to slowly worsen over time, and that can be concerning and necessitate imaging.
What did you do to determine that Jonathan's headaches were not chronic progressive?
So his headaches were off and on and were not chronically worsening. They weren't gradually getting worse over time.
Okay. And what's the basis of your, I mean, how did you reach that conclusion?
The fact that his headache at the time that he saw me was not the worst it had ever been, so that wasn't a worsening from when he'd been seen before, and that he had had a similar episode several months prior that was similar, as opposed to being significantly worse.
If Jonathan had a headache in December and no headaches between December and April, and then all of a sudden started having severe headaches with nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and pain in the occipital region of his head in April, would you have been more concerned about his condition such that you would have wanted to order head imaging?
Object to the foundation.
Are you speaking of a hypothetical patient?
Yes.
A hypothetical patient who had a headache in December and was symptom-free and then had an acute onset headache in the occipital region without anything inciting is potentially concerning, but part of the information that you would need would also be further history as well as physical examination.
Would you have ordered head imaging for a patient like that after your physical and examination, assuming it just confirmed everything that the patient had said about the history of headache?
Object to the lack of foundation.
I don't know.
Why would something like that be concerning?
An acute onset of a headache, especially if the worst of their life, is more concerning for something like an intracranial hemorrhage. But again, that's a hypothetical patient.
Do you know what a sentinel bleed is?
Yes.
What's a sentinel bleed?
A sentinel bleed is a bleed that can occur prior to a larger bleed later.
Do you know what the signs and symptoms of a sentinel bleed are?
Classically, they are a sudden, rapid worsening within a few minutes to seconds, with the worst headache of their life, often described as thunderclap, sometimes associated with neurologic findings.
You said sometimes. Would you agree with me that there have been cases of patients with sentinel bleeds that did not have focal neurological findings?
None that I'm familiar with.
Have you ever diagnosed a patient with a sentinel bleed?
I've never seen a patient with a sentinel bleed.
Have you ever seen a patient who was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm?
Aneurysm? Yes.
And were you able to make that diagnosis based upon the history and physical, or did you have to order head imaging in order to make that diagnosis?
Are you speaking of an aneurysm, or are you speaking of an intracranial hemorrhage?
Aneurysm.
Aneurysms, when I have been involved with their care, were usually diagnosed via testing like MRA and CTA.
Okay, but that diagnosis was made for a patient that you've seen in an emergency room setting?
No.
Okay. Do you remember the context of the patient that you may have seen that had that diagnosis?
I'm going back to residency
Okay.
as well as a personal acquaintance.
What about intracranial hemorrhage? Have you ever made that diagnosis in the emergency room?
Yes.
And was that based upon a history and physical?
Yes.
Okay. And how were you able to make that diagnosis based upon the history and physical?
The history of the patients I've seen were usually associated with worst headache, sometimes with seizure, and physical examination with patients who have had significant neurologic deficiencies.
Have you ever diagnosed intracranial hemorrhage in a patient who just complained of a worse headache but didn't have any neurological deficiencies and anything else? I mean, essentially it was just them saying that it was a worse headache.
Yes, I had a patient who had an intracranial hemorrhage who had had a seizure, but on initial presentation to me did not have neurologic findings,
Okay.
and one that had no headache at all.
And I'm assuming when you have a suspicion of an intracranial hemorrhage, you typically send the patient for head imaging?
Yes,
And I'm assuming you would do the same thing if for some reason you had a suspicion of there being a brain aneurysm, is that correct?
no. Aneurysms are frequently asymptomatic.
If you had a patient who you suspected might have an aneurysm that was symptomatic, would you order head imaging?
Meaning it was actively bleeding?
Correct.
By definition, that would be a version of intracranial hemorrhage, and yes, I would order imaging.
Okay. And what test would you order?
Immediately would be a CT scan of the head.
Do you read CT scans yourself?
As a preliminary read, yes, but they are read officially by the radiologist.
Okay. So I'm assuming then you rely upon the radiologist's interpretation with respect to the interpretation of the imaging studies, is that correct?
As the final authority, yes.
It looks like at the time you wrote your notes, you at that point read over Dr. Valderrama's note. Is there anything about her note that you disagreed with?
The fact that it says prior episodes, none.
Okay.
Those are check boxes to pick. And therapy today, none.
Okay. So you think she just missed those two?
I think so. Therapy, she may have interpreted as, did the patient take medication? However, therapy to me is doctor's office visit.
Is there any reason that she would have misunderstood what prior episodes mean?
I don't know.
The radiation of the pain to the neck area, is that sometimes associated with inflammation of the meninges?
Sometimes, yes.
Would that have been concerning?
It makes us consider other diagnoses, including meningitis, cervical neuralgia, or intracranial hemorrhage.
Were any of those things considered for Jonathan?
Of course, that's part of his evaluation.
Okay. But it sounds like you thought they were still less likely, though, given the fact that his neurological exam was normal.
I
Is that-
object to the form. Move to strike the testimony.
Is that correct?
Not exclusively.
Okay. What else made those things less likely?
The fact that his headache was moderate, the fact that his symptoms resolved completely, the fact that the headache itself was not thunderclap.
Dr. Valderrama writes, the patient presents with headache. The onset was chronic. You have any idea where she may have got that information from?
That's one of the check boxes to talk about how long the patient had been having symptoms. In her free text section, she said it was worsening over the past 24 hours.
Was it your understanding that he's been having a continuous chronic headache for a long period of time?
No, off
Okay.
and on.
And so what was your understanding as to how long he's been having this headache?
This headache had been going on per the history for approximately 24 hours.
Did you ask Jonathan or his mom any questions to distinguish between the headaches that he was having in the past and the headaches that he was having now?
It would have been part of my practice.
Okay. Can you tell me what questions you asked to that effect?
As part of my practice, is this headache similar to headaches you've had in the past? Is this
Okay.
different?
Did you ask any more specific questions about the location of the headache?
I don't recall.
Did you ask any questions about whether the headache he had in the past was associated with nausea or vomiting compared to this one?
I don't recall, though the records state he'd had a similar episode in January.
I understand that's what the record says, but if my recollection is correct, the record doesn't say whether that was associated with nausea or vomiting or not. You can certainly look at it if you want to.
Yes, similar episode.
Okay. And you took that to mean that he had had a headache with nausea and vomiting in the past. Is that correct?
If it's described as a similar episode, yes.
Okay. Did you ask how long the headaches he had had in the past lasted compared to this headache?
He didn't know.
Did you ask that question?
I would have as part of my practice.
Okay. How long do migraines typically last?
Up to a few days, though I've seen them last longer.
Have you read any sort of literature or guidelines that indicates that they last from 4 to 72 hours?
I believe that's considered to be the usual course.
And in fact, I think actually Shady Grove has discharge material that they provide the patients that says 4 to 72 hours.
Again, I believe that's the usual course.
Okay. if a headache went longer than 72 hours, would you become concerned about another possible cause of the headache?
Are you speaking about a hypothetical patient?
Yes.
No, don't answer that question. How is that in any way relevant to her evaluation? The history here is that it had been going on for a day.
I'll ask him additional questions. When you discharged the patient, you gave him instructions, him and his mom instructions, to come back to the hospital if certain things occurred, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I think we could actually look at that page. Page 21 to 60. It says, in big bold letters, get prompt medical attention if any of the following occur. Your head pain gets worse or does not improve within 24 hours. Why would the patient and his mom be told that?
Because if things are getting worse, not better, sometimes they need to be reevaluated.
Okay, and what would let's say Jonathan came back 2 days later and said that his headache pain was not improving. What would you do for him in a situation like that?
Don't answer that. You have to tell me how this is relevant to her evaluation of this patient on April 2.
If we're doing speaking objection, she's got to leave the room.
There's not going to be any answer unless you can demonstrate that this is relevant. Because right now what you're trying to do is to get her to testify on issues that relate to other parties in this case, and that's not appropriate. I'm not going to let her do it.
All right. You would have reevaluated the patient, though, is that correct? If he had come back and said his headache pain did not improve within 24 hours?
Did that happen in this case?
It did happen in this case.
With Dr. Martin, was she there?
You reviewed Dr. Mitchell's records, didn't you?
Yes, I've seen her records.
Okay. So you know Jonathan came back on April the 5th, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if he had come back on April the 5th, and since you read the records, I'm sure you're familiar with his complaints on April the 5th, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What would you have done for him if he had come back on the 5th?
Don't answer that. You have another question?
You're instructing her not to
I
answer
am.
that? For what reason?
I've just told you. Unless you can tell me in some way it's relevant to her treatment of Jonathan Valderrama on April 2nd, which was the only time she ever came in contact with this child. She's not going to answer the question.
Do you intend to testify in this case that your care and treatment complied with the standard of care?
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe Dr. Mitchell's care and treatment complied with the standard of care?
Don't answer that. She's
I'm
not going to be testifying to that in this case.
Do you believe Dr. Valderrama's treatment test was consistent with the standard of care?
Objection.
Let me think about that. You may answer that.
I believe so.
Okay. It also says to come back if there's repeated vomiting and can't keep liquids down. Why would that be told to the patient?
Because if you're unable to keep liquids down, you could become dehydrated, or it could be an indication that things are worse.
Do you know whether Jonathan had that?
I don't recall from Dr. Mitchell's note about the vomiting.
Was it your understanding that his headache pain became worse?
Wait, was it her understanding on April 2nd?
No,
That
after
it became worse later?
Let me finish. After he was discharged.
From what I understand, yes, his headache returned.
Okay. Would that have been concerning to you?
Objection, don't answer that.
It also says if he has a fever or a stiff neck to return as well, right?
Yes,
You know why it says that?
because those would be symptoms that are concerning and might prompt a reevaluation.
If you had seen Jonathan a second time several days later and he had said that his headache pain was getting worse and he had nausea, vomiting, and neck pain still, would you have ordered head imaging on that
Objection,
occasion?
don't answer that.
In Dr. Valderrama's note on page 12 of 60, if you look at medical decision making halfway down the page, I'll let you get there. It says 12-year-old boy here with worsened headaches, now associated with nausea, vomiting. Does that to you indicate that he had nausea, vomiting with prior episodes of headaches?
He may have had them in January when he had a similar episode, but the other headaches that he'd had between January and my visit in April, he may not have had nausea and vomiting.
Would that have been significant if he didn't have the nausea, vomiting during that period of time between January and April?
Potentially.
Why would that be significant?
When there's a new symptom, that's something that we tend to investigate.
And what kinds of things would you do to investigate it?
Close history and physical examination, response to treatment.
With regards to the response to treatment, are you aware that there are publications out there that indicate that a pediatric patient's response to, in particular, pain medication can't be relied upon to determine the cause of a headache?
I'm not familiar with that research.
Okay. Do you rely upon a pediatric patient's response to pain medication in assessing potential causes for a headache?
No, but it assists in disposition and follow-up planning.
Going back to the note here, the next sentence says, due to the chronicity, most likely this is a migraine headache. Do you agree with that phrasing?
It is not something I would have put under my rationale
And why is that?
because I never diagnose migraine in the emergency department.
Do you know whether Dr. Valderrama told the patient and his mom that he likely had migraines?
Not that I was aware of.
Okay. Would that have been something that you would have not have done if you were in her position?
I never diagnosed migraines in the emergency department.
Okay. So if the patient was told you likely have migraines, that's something that you would have preferred the patient not be told?
If a patient or family asks me if migraines is a possibility or if this is a migraine, I say, I don't know. It requires further evaluation and history.
Okay. Did you talk with Dr. Valderrama at all about her examination of the patient before you went in to examine the patient?
Yes.
Do you remember anything she said to you?
Nothing beyond what's in the note.
Do you know if Dr. Valderrama saw the patient a second or third time, just like you may have?
Per the notes, she saw him at least twice more.
Okay, and you might be looking at page 13 of 60?
Yes.
Okay. Now, she has notes in here under, I think, the re-examination, re-evaluation section for when she saw the patient a second and a third time. Is there a reason why you don't have Any follow-up notes where you went back in and saw the patient?
Because it's not necessarily something that I put in the attending attestation, because it's not something that's timed or dated during my examination.
Do you recall Dr. Valderrama discussing with you potential medications that should be ordered for the patient?
Not in great detail, but it was discussed.
Okay. Was there anything different than what was ultimately ordered, which I think was Toradol, Odinestrone, and it looks like IV saline?
I don't remember.
Why was the saline IV ordered?
For headaches, there can often be a component of dehydration, and treatment for headaches in a neurologically intact patient often include both pain medications, antiemetics if they're vomiting, and IV fluid.
Do you know how long you spent examining Jonathan the first time?
I don't recall the exact time.
And I looked through the record. I don't see anything specifically indicating your time in and time out of the room. Is that your understanding as well?
I don't think there's a way to record that.
Do you know how long you spent with him before he was discharged?
I didn't look at my watch when I went into the room, but I would estimate somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes.
And you can look at the medical record if you want to, but how was Jonathan feeling at the point when you made the decision to discharge him?
He was feeling at his baseline and normal, without headache or neck pain.
Is it your understanding that, what is your understanding of Jonathan's baseline?
His baseline was no headache, as his headaches had been off and on. He didn't have a chronic, he didn't have a headache continuously since December. He was sometimes symptoms-free.
And you don't know how many headaches he was having per month?
No, he didn't tell me. Or he couldn't tell me.
You said you looked at the International Pediatric records, right?
Briefly about a week ago.
Do you know, did you read the entire chart?
It was in brief.
When you say in brief, I don't know what that means.
It was skimmed over about a 5 to 10 minute period of time.
Okay. Did you, here, I'll show you a note. We'll have this marked as Exhibit 2. Is this one of the notes you saw?
What is that?
It's, sorry, Christine Anderson.
4/14/15.
I saw about the first sentence or two, but I did not read the entire letter.
Okay. So I just want to go over this with you. This is Christine Tanner was the nurse practitioner that sent him to the hospital on April the 2nd, 2015. And she says this statement is to document the events that occurred after my physical exam of Jonathan Valadares on April the 2nd, 2015. After my exam, I explained to Jonathan and his mother that I did not see any symptoms consistent with sinusitis and that I did not believe that he was experiencing the same infection as he had in December. I explained that I saw no reason for him to have such severe vomiting and no other sign of infection that would explain his headaches. I then explained that it was important for him to get further evaluation in the emergency department to rule out any more serious causes for the headaches. Jonathan and his mother agreed with this plan and said they would go straight to Shady Grove Abingdon's Hospital. I immediately called Shady Grove Abingdon's Hospital and spoke with an intake nurse in the pediatric ED. I gave the patient's name, date of birth, and vital signs. I explained that I was sending him in for evaluation of severe headache, neck pain, and vomiting. I reported that physical exam and vitals were normal, but that he appeared very ill. I denied any history of head injury. At this time, Jonathan and his family left the office for Shady Grove Adventist Hospital. Would knowing that information have changed the way that you approached Jonathan's care and treatment?
Are we speaking of a hypothetical situation?
Yes.
I don't know.
Why don't you know?
Because his presentation on my evaluation on April 2nd was not consistent with his presentation or her opinion of how he looked at that time.
Do you believe, would you have given any weight to the pediatrician who sent Jonathan over to the hospital, give any weight to what they had reported they saw earlier in the day?
Objection to the foundation.
Objection, foundation.
There's no such thing as bad information. Sometimes having more information is good. And I believe there was a note that she had written that day as well that may also provide information.
Okay. I just want to know, based upon this information that you see on this page, if it was presented that way to you, that this is what she had seen earlier on April the 2nd, and that's why she's sending him to the emergency room to be further evaluated, would that have impacted your assessment of Jonathan in any way?
Objection asked and answered.
Objection, asked and answered.
How's that any different than what you asked a minute and a half ago?
Would it have, let me try to rephrase it, would it have changed in any fashion the scope of your examination of Jonathan?
Same objection.
It may have, but again, this was not the information that was available to me at the time.
Okay. So you did not know this information that's on this page, is that correct?
The only information I had from International Pediatrics was in the pre-arrival note.
Okay. Would this information as presented have heightened your level of concern for the patient and the potential causes for his headaches?
Objection, asked and answered. Foundation.
I join those two objections.
Again, in a hypothetical situation, maybe.
When you say, why would it be a maybe?
Same
Because
objection.
patients' presentations can change based on the time they're evaluated. For example, somebody sent in by the pediatrician's office for concern of appendicitis upon arrival to the ER may have a very different physical examination and indeed not have a diagnosis of appendicitis at all. So it's, again, difficult to speak in a hypothetical since this is not the information that I had upon my evaluation.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm aware of all the conversations you had with Jonathan and his mother. Did Jonathan or his mother at any point in time ask about head imaging?
Not that I recall.
Did you consider head imaging as a possible option for Jonathan?
Consider, yes, but given his history, his physical examination, and his reevaluations and improvement, I thought that his case would be best served by outpatient further evaluation and imaging if requested by those seeing him as an outpatient.
Did you discuss any of that with Jonathan and his mother, that thought process you just relayed to me?
Not that I recall in great detail, though I know my custom and practice.
Okay. So that's to say that it sounds like your custom and practice would have been to mention something to Jonathan and his mother about the possibility of having head imaging in the future?
I object to the form of that question.
That's not always discussed, but in a patient who's been having multiple episodes of headache over a period of months, I always discuss keeping a headache diary to write down symptoms, when they occur, what was happening when they occurred, response to any medications, additional symptoms, so that they can give that information to the next person who evaluates them, which may help with eventual diagnosis or further potential testing or imaging.
Did you tell Jonathan and his mother to keep a headache diary?
I would have, it's my custom and practice.
That would have been part of your plan for the patient, correct?
Yes.
Is that written anywhere in the medical chart?
The discussed plan for follow-up, that's part of my custom and practice for every patient who has had chronic headaches over a period of time.
In this medical chart, though, did it specifically say that he should keep a headache diary?
It's not in the chart, but again, that's my custom and practice.
Is there any reason why it wouldn't be in the chart?
Because if I were to list everything that I said, I would have gone on for several paragraphs and likely needed a transcriber with me.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you told Jonathan and his mother. Do you recall saying anything to them about head imaging?
I do not recall.
Do you believe you may have said something like that and just didn't put it in the medical chart?
I don't recall. It's possible, but I don't recall.
What else did you tell Jonathan and his mother about future treatment?
I said you can try medication like ibuprofen at home if things are getting worse, and if they aren't, and ibuprofen doesn't work, come back.
Did you discuss at all with Jonathan and his mother following up with any other physicians?
I discussed follow-up with primary care.
Okay. Did you say that they should do that within a certain time frame?
I said within the next day or so. It's listed in the chart as 1 to 3 days. and to come back sooner to the emergency department if there was anything that concerned them.
Do you remember Jonathan and his mother having any questions for you?
Not that I recall.
The last time you saw Jonathan, was Dr. Valderrama in the room with you?
I don't remember.
Do you remember ever being in the room with Dr. Valderrama at the same time when you were seeing Jonathan?
I don't recall.
After Jonathan was discharged, did you have any further contact with Dr. Valderrama where you discussed Jonathan's care?
I don't recall.
Would you agree with me that Jonathan's presentation was inconsistent with tension headaches?
At the time of his presentation to me, tension headaches is less likely.
Would you agree with me that cluster headaches would also be less likely?
On the presentation to me, less likely.
Was there anything about Jonathan's presentation when you saw him on April the 2nd, besides what you've already told me, that made migraines more likely?
Not particularly.
If you look at page 13 to 60, in the impression and plan section, it says counseled patient, family regarding diagnosis, regarding treatment plan. That's not your note, correct?
Oh, that is more check boxes that are in the disposition section of the note.
Okay. Well, was it you that checked those boxes, or was that Dr. Valderrama?
That would have been Dr. Valderrama.
Okay. Do you know whether Dr. Valderrama may have had an independent conversation about the diagnosis and treatment plan with the patient?
I don't recall.
Okay. Prior to discharge, are residents allowed to have conversations with the patients regarding diagnosis and future treatment plans?
Yes.
I'm just asking because it sounds like they obviously get that information from you as well, so they potentially could be getting it from two different physicians.
It's possible.
Okay. Just some cleanup questions. You don't intend to render any standard of care opinions in this case other than the fact that you believe you complied with the standard of care, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm assuming you do not intend to render any opinions about the cause of death for Jonathan?
No.
Okay. And it sounds like you don't intend to render any opinions about the cause of his aneurysm?
No.
Okay. And you don't intend to render any opinions about whether he had a sentinel bleed and the timing of the bleed, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. These are more legal questions. I don't want to be surprised at trial if all of a sudden you have an opinion about one of these topics.
As far as I know, those are the
Okay.
correct answers
All
to
right.
give. I'm not a lawyer.
And I'm assuming you don't have any opinions that you intend to offer at trial regarding the cause of his intracranial hemorrhage. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. I have no further questions.
No questions for me. We would like to read and sign, please.
Time now is 5:43. This deposition has concluded.